had the opportunity for an Ask the Rabbi on Shabbat morning. This year, I felt it would be a little more difficult with larger numbers of people and not seeing everybody and being able to take the questions. I requested back a couple weeks ago, and it's been online and announced last Shabbat for individuals to submit questions. And over the last week and a half, I've received a wide variety of questions. Probably could just divide it up and for the rest of the year have enough material for Shabbat morning of what many of you were interested in hearing about. I've chosen a few to answer this morning. The very first one being a ritual question around kashrut. So the question was, why do we consider chicken to be fleishik, but yet we consider eggs to be pariv? Right? Chickens are fleishik, but we can take the egg of a chicken and crack it open and mix it up with cheese and butter. We consider it pariv. Now, believe it or not, although it might sound like it, this is not a question with a simple answer. Why? Well, first of all, we Jews have never done simple. It's just not part of our DNA. You may be aware, just to put a more relatively recent historical context to this question, that when Beit Yisrael, when the Ethiopian Jews first encountered Jews from outside their sheltered life over centuries, Beit Yisrael, and observing their form of Judaism, they themselves, Beit Yisrael, these Ethiopian Jews, could not understand why a chicken was considered to be fleishik to begin with. They considered a chicken to be pariv. How? Because essentially they missed the entire development of the history of the rules of kashrut as part of rabbinic Judaism, as we call it, in the Mishnah and the Talmud. Actually, Beit Yisrael, the Ethiopian Jews, were basing their kashrut directly from the Torah, which talks about mixing and not mixing of basar v'chalav, of meat and milk, which for them, one might understand logically meant basar, meant beef, cows, meat. It was actually only later that Jewish tradition expanded in a sense from the biblical ruling tradition that chicken was in the same category as beef for many reasons, although there continued to be for a century or two later segments of Jewry, like in Denmark, that continued treating chicken as pariv. To this day, actually, when I teach a Jew by choice, they understand the tradition and the rules of kashrut, but they rarely understand why chicken would be considered fleishik, like meat. Imagine what it would be like for those of us who keep kosher if rabbinic Judaism had ruled, as some wished, that chicken was pariv, right? Chick-fil-A, anybody, right? So we have to come back to the question, why are eggs pariv? Now, we won't discuss this morning why milk coming from a cow is dairy. That's for another time. You may be familiar with the important Torah mitzvah that we see of not taking the eggs or the fledglings whilst the mother bird is nearby. The reward we're actually given in the Torah of having a long life. The rabbis took that mitzvah in the Bible to mean that the egg is an independent entity from the mother. The egg is considered completely different from its origin, from its mother. Actually, in the laws of kashrut, when the list of birds that are not kosher is given, it mentions the ostrich, and then it adds the word as a bird and its offspring, which rabbinic tradition took to meaning its egg, right? Another interpretation reiterating that the egg is a separate category. It's treated independently. Later, actually, the Talmud would rule, just to show you that if you happen to shecht an egg, you killed an egg to be a chicken, I'm sorry, to be able to eat it, and there was an egg inside the chicken, that egg would be considered fleshik, not pariv. So this must, again, lead us to understand that the Torah is teaching us that eggs are an independent entity, unrelated to the birds who are laying them, meaning one would assume, potentially, that all eggs, even ostrich eggs, are kosher, right? Wrong, right? Because the Mishnah teaches us in Brachot, very first tractate, Shahayotse mehatamei tamei, vahayotse min hatahor tahor. That which emerges from the impure, an animal, a category that is impure, is still impure. And that which emerges from the pure is pure. By extension from that, so too are all the edible items produced by non-kosher animals, whether it's milk, skin, etc. They are all to be considered non-kosher. Long answer from a very simple question. The second one that I chose, one that we literally could easily spend an entire morning on or adult learning session, is on the broad question about support for Israel from the various parts of American political leadership. Questions obviously on the mind given our recent election. For many Jews, perhaps up to around 30%, especially as we know in the more traditional Jewish communities, the reason why they in particular voted for President Trump in this last election, we know, was in large part because of his strong support for the state of Israel, or at least to say for the vision of the Likud-run Netanyahu government, and of course the Israeli population itself of almost 70%, views which we know may not be completely supported by the majority of Jews in America. Now, I've said this before, although I didn't agree with everything that the Trump administration did with regard to their policies around Israel, I have spoken numerous times over the years about what, in my opinion, were moves made, some of which, like the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, was long overdue, and other parts of the more recent roadmap peace process, which led to growing peace between the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan, and we hope with this soon with Saudi Arabia, with reports denied on one side that Netanyahu met this past week with the Crown Prince. On the other hand, I have to admit, not being happy at all at the end of the Obama administration with the lack of a veto by John Kerry in the UN about Israel. It's always been important, however, for me to note that prior to running for president, Donald Trump was not pretty much in his entire life engaged in any way to the support of Israel, either by giving or speaking about Israel herself, until he became president, or until he became president-elect. President Trump had never been to the state of Israel. I also believe that the Trump's support of Israel was for the most part, transactional, with the knowledge that if he supported whatever the current government of Israel wanted, the evangelical community that he needed as part of his base would have good reason to throw their complete support behind him when they may have disagreed about other aspects of his life. Many rabbis, including me, have experienced many times over the past 4 years large groups of people that we encountered throughout Israel who were simply called Trump's ministers and were given special VIP attention in their trips to Israel. Now, I have to say that in some ways, we as a Jewish community have done the same in our relationship with the evangelical community as well. Their support for Israel is based on the eschatological end of the world scenario where Jesus returns and is dependent on a remnant, on a Jewish presence in the Holy Land. And of course, in their belief that when that comes, the Jews will finally accept Jesus as the Messiah. Now, I've often said, just like I described, I believe, a bargain that was made from the Trump administration, that the Jews have made that bargain, and actually it's been a bargain that I've always been willing to make. If the evangelical community supports Israel as they are very strongly behind politically, amongst their rank and file, financially, visiting, then if the time comes that Jesus returns and turns out to be the Messiah, so be it. I'll deal with it then. Now, that, of course, has led many to ask, what about President-elect Biden? For Joe Biden, as I referenced, I believe last week or the week before, his relationship with Israel is anything but transactional, but rather a commitment from his heart, from his kishkas, one of which he was raised and has followed through for more than 40 years in both his public and his private life. So personally, I have no doubt about a Biden administration's support of Israel, both financially or militarily. It is interesting to note, as we as Jews always do, that 4 of the proposals that we've heard of his inner cabinet are Jewish, and most of them strongly connected to the Jewish community. There were 2 interesting developments you may have noticed in the last couple of weeks relating to the Palestinian Authority, who have been boycotting what is in essence critical cooperation with Israel in dealing with the territories after feeling sidelined in the peace process, after, of course, from our perspective, an unwillingness for a long time to engage directly with Israel one-on-one. The Palestinian Authority said this past Tuesday that it was resuming its cooperation with Israel, that military cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, ending, which included willing to accept money from Israel that it collects on their behalf for taxes, which ended 6 months of financial hardship for tens of thousands of West Bank residents, and signaling their relief over the election of Joe Biden. This was one of the first clear signs of the anticipation of a new administration is having an effect on international relations. The Palestinian announcement undid also, interestingly, a set of stringent measures imposed by Mohammed Abbas, the PA's president, in May in a desperate protest against the plans by Netanyahu to unilaterally annex portions of the occupied West Bank. Also, in a bold move to refurbish their sullied image in Washington, the Palestinians are laying groundwork for an overhaul of one of their most cherished, but as far as we are concerned, controversial practices, compensating those who serve time in Israeli prisons, including for violent attacks. That policy from our side called pay to slay has long been denounced by Israel and by our Jewish communities as giving incentive to terrorism because it assures that these would-be attackers, that their dependents would be well cared for. Without doubt, with a new administration, there will be challenges that we will face between large parts of the Jewish community, challenges and disagreements that the Jewish community had internally even prior, including questions of re-entering a deal with Iran, and continued pressure on parts of the Democratic Party on Israel and the Palestinians to re-enter into peace negotiations. Bottom line is, I truly believe that support of Israel is not transactional, but rather in, literally, as I said, Joe Biden's kishka. And even though we can pretty much guarantee, because Israel and America are not one and the same, that we're not going to like every decision, I know that he will continue to be a chaver, a good friend of Israel. So I actually want to end with a connection to the Torah portion, but also connects to some questions about the pandemic within Jewish tradition. And I guess it was a Torah question in tying it together. What does our Torah portion of this morning, Harry Potter, and the pandemic have in common? Would you ever imagine there's a connection between our Torah portion, Harry Potter, and the pandemic? And the answer, our first aliyah, the very first one we chanted this morning, tells a story that in the context of the excitement of the beginning, with the ladder going up to heaven and Jacob fleeing, and the back and forth between Jacob and Lavan and marrying Rachel and Leah, this story is often just pushed to the side. In it, Leah's oldest son, Ruvain, picks some mandrakes called dudim in Hebrew, a plant which was actually known throughout the ancient Near East for its medicinal properties. Rachel, who is still childless, wants those mandrakes. And Leah, who received them from her son, agrees to trade the plants for a night with Jacob in her tent. And actually on that night, Leah becomes pregnant with her fifth son. Now, the rabbis in Jewish tradition were not exactly sure what mandrakes are, but they must have had some kind of mysterious properties, because shortly afterwards, Rachel becomes pregnant with Yosef, with Joseph. Mandrakes have a long history as a plant with magical properties. Numerous superstitions surround the plant. Those of you that have studied early American history, there were women who were accused of witchcraft and that were thought to use mandrakes. There's even a tradition that the plant screams when it is picked, and the screams themselves can be deadly. And here's where the Harry Potter comes in. Those of you that have read the books, as I did, all of them cover to cover many years ago, mandrakes played a major role in Harry Potter's schooling at Hogwarts, where they overcame the spell of the monster in the Chamber of Secrets. Now, this and many other stories points to an idea still prevalent today in the attitudes of many, that medicines are magical potions and that they must be used with great care. The Torah actually is concerned about this. It warns against the use of magic. But this idea that medicines that can be magic potions and must be used with great care are really not some ancient superstition. In Brooklyn, even in parts of Baltimore amongst the ultra-Orthodox community. You may remember last year when there was a severe outbreak of measles. Many refused to vaccinate their children. The leaders of the anti-vaccine movement held meetings with leaders of the Orthodox community in New York and other places to express the dangers of vaccinations. With the good news of vaccines that have been coming just in the last couple of weeks, developing around COVID-19, there is already, as we know, a large backlash by those in the anti-vaccine community, many of whom believe that they're a ploy by big pharmaceutical to gain huge profits, but many who claim that a vaccination is a medication out of control and dangerous. It will be unfortunate, not surprising, when a large percentage of people, including many in the more traditional Orthodox community, who will refuse an anti-COVID vaccine. In truth, vaccines are not magic. They are medicine, refuah, pikuach nefesh, which we know is one of the highest principles that we have in Judaism in saving life, and not just ours, but others. Vaccines are a proven scientific method to fight disease. It's actually reason why rabbis across the religious spectrum, from Reform to Chabad, have spoken out in favor of vaccines. Many of you heard or read about the recent Supreme Court decision that was made reversing a ruling in New York about limits of people attending services. It was done by the Catholic Church and by the ultra-Orthodox. Honestly, when we deal as a Jewish community historically and today, we take a whole list of things that are important to us, values that are critical to us, and we know always the need to balance them. In this case, I still really don't understand how you can take two important parts of our tradition, tefillah b'tzibur, davening together as a community in person, and pikuach nefesh, the saving of life, for which you can overrule almost any mitzvah in the Torah and say that they are equal or should be given equal weight. The COVID vaccine is coming. When it becomes available to all of us, not an easy task during a governmental crisis, hundreds of thousands of lives will be saved. The vaccine is not a magic potion like the ancient mandrake. It's science. I certainly will be vaccinated as soon as it will be available to me. And I pretty much know and hope that everyone else here this morning will do the same. We will continue now as Alan Posner leads us in the Chatzi Kaddish of the Musaf service, the middle of